After d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop f4, we have the Veresov on the board. In the previous videos we went through the Veresov bishop g5 variation, and here the most popular one in this video is going to be the one with the bishop f4. So here the move to continue now is c5. So we have a very similar pattern to the previous videos. Now let's quickly mention that knight to b5 is not a thing in this situation. Yes, sometimes they do it, but they do it by mistake. Knight b5 with the idea of going to c7, but in this case this cannot be played simply because the knight is not defended by the bishop. So queen a5 is to be played now, and then the knight is forced to go back to c3. Now black can take the pawn in d4, the knight is pinned. So after queen takes back, only move to save the knight. Black develops the knight going to c6, and now white's best move is queen to a4, looking desperately for a swap with the queen, also because of the threat of pushing the pawn to d4, winning the knight. So after queen to a4, black can happily trade and now conquer the center with e5. So black is better here. White best move would be a bishop to g5, but then black plays knight to e4. And it has typical idea of pushing the king side, especially because the queens are no longer on the board. So after bishop to h5, g5 is perfectly fine, bishop to g3, and we are able to take the bishop. We don't have to do it immediately, that's why best move by black is this cheeky d4 move. We have two attackers now to the square c3. We're planning to play something like bishop b4 maybe, and win material. White's best move is c4, also because b5 would have trapped the knight. So after c4, white capitalizes with h5, trying to trap the bishop. After h4, in order to give a shelter for the bishop. These are all forced moves, and this variation isn't very popular, but we're just mentioning very quickly so that we can move on to the next one. Bishop b4 check comes now, and when the king moves, black continues with g4, and the black knight, well, the black bishop is attacking these squares, making the king unable to move. The knight is threatening f2, so the bishop can't really go back to h2 without being forked. And of course, trying to develop the light square bishop is not possible because we can just take the pawn for free, and then the bishop would be unguarded if the pawn were to take. The bishop can't develop from the fianchetto, and a move like a3 attacking the bishop will just be met by bishop to d2, and the knight can't really develop from anywhere. So the position is evaluated about -9, which is an insane evaluation. So let's go back. After c5, knight b5 cannot be played. So let's have a look at this very normal move, which is e3, and that allows the bishop to defend the square in b5. Black continues now with this key move, bishop to g4, attacking the queen. So let's have a look at a bunch of different ideas. There will be f3, bishop e2, knight e2, or knight f3. Let's start with f3, which is very popular, and I've encountered it a lot. Bishop goes back to d7 now, and so after the knight to b5 move, which in this case is possible, then we just take. And after bishop takes with check, we have given up the bishop pair for a reason. Knight now plays to c6, and well, it is up to the white player in case he wants to give up the bishop pair as well. Then in that case, he's just not getting anything out of it. And besides, the white king side is less safe than the black player king side. So besides, white has to be very careful to what he does. Right now, black is threatening queen a5 check, winning the bishop. So white has to do something about it. After the best move by white, which is a4, black continues with e6. Looks like a very normal game, right? There's not going to be like any surprising moves. It's a solid d4, d5 game. So after the development of the knight to e2, the only square where it makes sense to develop, black continues with bishop e7, and after castling, black now attacks the bishop. So now the bishop is forced to move. And going back to d3 will get him trapped by the pawn in c4. So after the bishop takes the knight and then pawn takes back, we haven't really given up the bishop pair for nothing. We have simply messed up, well, white actually messed up his position in the pawn structure in the center by himself by playing the f3 move. So the idea of the black player now is simply to take control of the center by having more pawns. we were happy about that pawn, the bishop trade of the c6 square, so that we could take back with the pawn. And we have this typical pattern of the doubled pawn. We're going to go to d4. So either white plays the best move, which according to the engine is king to h1, just a prophylactic move with the usual idea of playing rook g1, g4, g5, which is the best plan by white. Or even if white does something else, still we're going to proceed with these moves. Castle, and after g4 by white, which is the best move, black continues with knight to d7, applying more pressure to c5, since that is a key square. And after rook to g1, we can take the pawn. And now we're going to go through pawn takes. Very quickly, let's mention how things get a little ugly for white, and there's no point in taking with the knight. Yeah, it is possible, so let's quickly look at it. Knight takes. And now, of course, we don't have a fork at the moment because knight c6, it's a terrible situation for black. So black simply plays queen to c8, and now is threatening e5. Although even after knight e5, knight can go to f5, attacking the bishop, and yeah, that's not ideal. Although black is still slightly better. So black's got ideas of like rook e8, for example, bishop f8, and then e5 is coming anyway. And so because e5 is coming no matter what, white's only idea in this case could be bishop to g3, and then potentially reinforce maybe with f4 or probably rook e1. There's plenty of ideas. Let's look at bishop g3 and see how do we exploit this. And even if white hadn't played bishop g3, c5 will come anyway to attack the knight. The knight will have to move. Let's look at knight e2 and knight b3. So after knight e2, queen to c6. It's important to put the queen in this diagonal because we want to do a breakthrough of pawns with an attack on f3. After queen c6, let's look at a couple more moves. c3 to put more defense over d4. Rook a to d8. Black's development is complete. The situation is evaluated about as if black was up a piece. And d4 is coming. So even if white were to play this move, which I've encountered personally before, it's not a problem. d4 comes. And we have this idea of attacking and winning two crucial pawns, especially since the pawn in f3 was pinned, so it couldn't really push forward. So just to make an example, the situation falls apart after pawn takes, queen takes with check, rook g2, and now taken in b4. This pawn would be isolated, this one would be taken. So in this position, instead of knight e2, let's see, for example, knight to b3. Black continues with bishop to f6, attacking the pawn. So these are all forced moves. After c3, for example, bishop to e5, swapping with this very strong bishop, and then placing the knight into magnificent squares, especially considering that this knight will never have any future. If white avoids the swap by playing f4, then bishop to c7, covering the a5 square, reducing even more the influence of the knight. The idea by black now is to play queen to b7, attacking the knight and skewering and go for the pawn. How do we highlight the limits of this knight? Well, for example, knight to d2, we play c4, and in this situation, yeah, white looks like he has an idea of playing b3, but then we can just take, and then white knight can take back, bishop to b6, attacking this weak pawn, and also white will have his isolated pawn, so black will go to a favorable endgame. In order to defend both pawns, the queen can try queen to d2, defending both, but then queen to c4, attacking the knight. And after the move looks like he's gonna hold everything and continue to a normal endgame, knight to d4 will be met by knight to f6, the knight reaching the crucial e4 outpost. And again, black's advantage is like a piece up. We're gonna stop the line here because we went too far. Black has a favorable endgame because of white's isolated pawn. There's a backwards pawn in e3. The knight's much better placed. And yeah, there's no way to calculate what's going to happen next. But it shouldn't be that hard. So back at this position, just a couple of moves ago, we notice how b3 doesn't really help. So let's look very quickly at another plan, like a move like f5 in this situation. Black ignores that, and you know what, when you have a pawn structure that looks like this, you'd rather get taken and then take back and activate the rook. So after rook to b8, we're still going for this pawn. So after rook to b1, black now can take the dark square bishop, and after rook takes back, because, well, you don't want to take back with a pawn like that, queen to c6, going for this weak pawn, and we're going to take it. The idea is that even if the pawn were to push, let's say a5, rook to b5, there's no way to stop that. An idea by white could be knight f3 with placing the knight in d4, but we couldn't stop that with e5. It's important to do that because that knight would have been a monster. After a move like g5, which is a potential attempt by white, looks like these two pawns could be some trouble, breaking the pawn structure in front of the king. Black will very quietly simply take the pawn in a5. And after f6, if that's what white is going for, then g6. Again, black's advantage is evaluated a piece up. You can tell why. The rook will eventually go back to b5. The queen has a future plan of going to e6 with the knight going to c5 and reaching d3. The rook will line up with the other rook going for this pawn, and this pawn is crucially controlling these squares. The black pawns are more advanced. Soon this pawn is going to be a passed pawn. So let's end the line here. So after pawn takes back, c5. This is a typical maneuver to get more control over the center. So if white continues with g5, we can take the pawn in d4, and black is just better. Let's see what happens if instead of g5, white continues with c3. Or white could have played this move before as well. Black continues with queen to b6, putting more pressure over d4 and attacking b2. So after queen to d2, which seems logical and it's developing a queen connecting the rooks, black continues with rook f to e8, protecting the pawn that will be in charge of an important breakthrough afterwards. And after g5, only attacking move by white, we take the pawn in the center, pawn takes back, and now black's best move is to re-maneuver this rook from e8 in this case and control the open file by going to c8. The reason is that now that this file is open, we want to play typical maneuver of queen to b3 and then bringing the rook up, doubling them up, and controlling the second rank. Besides, white has an isolated pawn in d4 that we're going to be targeting with the passage of time. So if white plays a very normal move like rook a to c1, challenging the open file, black continues with the same plan, besides also attacking a pawn this time. So after knight to c3, reducing the control of the black's rook over the c file and also protecting the pawn in a4, black is simply better after knight to b6. The evaluation of the engine here is fairly favorable for black. Black's idea is going with the knight to c4 in this case, and later on play moves like rook to c6 and rook to c8, doubling them up on the light squares. So let's make a recap. After bishop f4 move and c5 and e3, black immediately attacks the queen. So what happens after bishop e2? Now black can take the pawn in d4. We use our c pawn to take the d pawn, and we're also attacking the knight. So what happens if white takes the bishop in g4? We obviously take the knight now. So after pawn takes in c3, black goes on with queen a5, and now this pawn in c3 cannot be defended. If queen d2, for example, then that loses a piece, and if the bishop moves to e5, then we simply take the bishop in g4 for free, because if queen takes back, then knight to c6 will remove the bishop from the defending role of the c3 square. So whatever happens next, let's say bishop goes back, e5, and now there's nothing to do for the bishop. And if the bishop had gone somewhere else, well, yeah, then we have access to c3. So white's best move right now, according to engine, is bishop f5. The idea obviously to go back to d3, well, save the bishop from the knight, go back to d3, give more protection to the weak diagonal of this eventually weak white king. Black continues with g6, attacking the bishop. Bishop to d3, and now we finally check. Queen can't move because then the rook will fall. So after king f1, black continues with knight b to d7, and after white's best move, removing the rook from the attack of the queen so that the white queen can move freely, black's best move is queen to c8, all the way down to protect the pawn in b7. So after, now the white player might try to play a normal game. After knight to f3 and bishop to g7, thing is that the white player can't really castle. So the thematic move now is h4. White will want to try and cut and maybe develop the rook later on from the h or g file, or simply just continue pushing, and then h5 and be swap, maybe play h6 depending on what black does. After h4, black continues with knight to e4. The idea obviously is to go to c3. This is too strong, and best reply according to computer is to take the knight. Pawn takes back, and now we're gonna look at two options. It's basically knight d4 and knight d2. Knight g5, well, knight e5 is not accessible, there's too much attack by black. Knight g5 doesn't make any sense after queen c6 defending the pawn, because the knight will be kicked out, it's just wasting time. And so after knight to d4, black castle, and the idea now is to play e5. So if white goes on with this move h5, then simply e5. Providing the white player is a strong player, and we'll see that knight to b5. And now black continues with queen c4 check. And so after the natural development of the queen, so the queen wants to develop, and that's a good excuse. But even if the queen hadn't done this move, and the king had moved somewhere else, we're still free to take this pawn with an attack on the rook. And we're gonna stop the line there because we've just gone too far now. We've been out of theory for a while, but this is basically the way this setup is to be played. Back in this position, if knight goes to d2, black plays again this move, queen c6, defending the pawn. And after h5, best move by white, black continues with rook to d8. Now h6, we can allow that to happen because black can play bishop to c3. Let's have a look at a few more moves to see how this is going to be played. Black literally doesn't care about castling. After white's best move, which is knight to b3, finally going to be using the knight because he was doing nothing in d2. Black continues with g5. This obviously cannot be played because of queen b5 check. So after bishop g3 and rook to g8, this pawn now, this is the moment to finally explain how important it was to let this pawn just go to h6. Understand why that's not a problem, because you see the white rook in the h file has only one way of developing. It cannot castle anymore, so it can never go to the central file like this, so it will have to go this way. So the fact that these two pawns are now stuck is just in favor of the black player, and white cannot develop this h1 rook. So after the best move by white, which is king to g1, maybe with an idea of king h2 and develop the rook potentially later on the central files, black plays the unbelievable f5. Unbelievable, why? Because, well, there's nothing to worry about this check, but it's fun that we're allowing that to happen. Rook to g6 now is the best move. And now we like this fortress like this in here because white can never penetrate it. The idea now is to play knight to f6, forcing the queen away, and then afterwards black will play e5, and idea of e5, f4 and stuff like that. So it's white to move now, but we've gone very far with this showing the setup, so we're gonna have to finish this line as well. Let's just mention that this knight is currently stuck, and the queen also has threats potentially. Depends on what white does, but also of going to a4 and target a bunch of weaknesses, try to infiltrate the territory. This rook really can't play, and the king is actually just safe in there. Knight d4, a move that looks normal, can't be played because of simply bishop takes, and then we're going to be able to play this f4 pattern. It's just overwhelmingly strong, and the game is going to get ridiculous after this move. Look at this too. So let's go on. Back at the starting position. After e3, we attack the queen immediately, and bishop e2, we take the pawn. So as we said, we're looking at the line where the bishop takes the bishop, and we take the knight. What happens if the bishop retreats to e2? Now we can take the pawn with an attack on the rook, only moves rook to b1, and now queen a5 check. If queen blocks, then we can take in a2, and it's already game over for white, and black should be winning this game very easily. If king moves to f1, black continues with knight e4 and idea of knight to c3. So if queen tries to block by going to queen to c3, queen to d4, getting out of the d1 forkable square, well, then knight d2 will fork these two. So the white player can't forget that there's plenty of forks available. If white tries a normal move like knight to f3, then knight c3, queen to d2 is interesting because it's pinning the knight. So now the black player will just move the queen to a3, protecting the pawn and still going for this and now this is unstoppable. After rook to e1, for example, still keeping an eye on b1, although to be fair, it's not enough. Black continues with the cheeky knight to c6 move. This is a computer move, completely ignoring the fact that we could promote. Well, nothing's going to stop Black from promoting anyway and winning a lot of material. So yeah, I mean, pushing the pawn up here instead of knight to c6 is absolutely excellent as well. In this position, after king to f1 and Black plays knight to e4, attacking c3, what happens if the rook takes in b2? Then knight check, queen can't take because of the king, and after because of the queen, and after king e1, then knight c4, and with this is a discover check. So from the start, let's have a look at this line, which is the one that is a bit more rational. So after e3, we attack the queen, bishop e2, and we take the pawn. So what happens when the pawn simply takes back? So the white player resists the temptation of taking the light square, strong black bishop, and simply takes back in d4. Then we take the white bishop. There's two ways that make sense to take back, which is with the queen or with the knight. We're going to look at both of them. So after queen takes, Black continues with a6, stopping the annoying trade of queens that might happen if queen b5. And after knight f3, Black continues with the usual e6. And after castling, knight to c6, looks like a very normal game. The only thing is that Black has two pawns in the two central files, and White has the weakness of which we've talked about a lot, especially if you want, go look at my videos where I talk about the London system, how to defeat the London system when White plays the knight c3 instead of pushing the c pawn, and see how the weakness comes after rook c8 and all the ways to control the c file. After rook a to d1 to protect the pawn. In fact, White wants to play the thematic knight e5, but right now that's not possible because of knight d4. So after rook a to d1, bishop e7, knight e5, and rook to c8. You could make it more boring and more normal, but Black is just better here. Black's position is much better because White will have to take quite a few tempos to allow the white pawn to connect with the d4 pawn, and that's going to be crucial for Black to improve the position more and more. After rook f to e1, developing the last rook, and Black finally castles. So we're going to look at two moves quickly, bishop to g3 and then the knight moving away. So bishop to g3 might be an idea, and then White player will have to move the queen, then the queen will have to move, and then knight e2, knight f4, knight d3 to support the knight, and also potentially jump to c5. The knight will be better, and the pawn will be able to move. So I've seen this type of idea as well. And okay, so bishop g3, this is met by queen to b6, attacking the pawn. And yeah, the queen is not defending that because this silly c2 pawn is a problem for White. A move like b3 is simply met by knight takes d4 because we have two pieces attacking there. So after knight to a4, queen to b4, still doubling the attack on d4 and also attacking the knight. After b3 now is necessary, again we can take the pawn for free. And if White doesn't play b3 but simply plays knight to c6 with an attack on the queen and the bishop, while taking the knight, then we simply take and we begin our control over the c file. b3 now to defend the knight is met by b5, and the knight is forced to go to b2. Now Black continues with knight to e4, threatening knight to c3, winning the game, and it's just too hard to stop. Position is just so far superior by Black right now. Black will also eventually play the other rook to c8. The queen has also got capacity to infiltrate and take the pawns. And yeah, let's stop the line here. In this situation, earlier we went through an idea of bishop to g3, but we played too many forced moves for White to be able to make that plan we talked about. So let's have a look at this one, knight to b1, and the idea of remaneuvering the knight like that. Now we can take the knight in e5. So after pawn takes back, knight goes to d7. And after finally the White player is able to play the move like c3, Black continues with rook to c4, attacking the bishop. Bishop to g3 is met by rook to e4, the queen will have to move. So after queen to f3, best move, the rook takes the rook, check, rook takes back, and now queen to a5. attacking a pawn. Knight a3 will be attacked too many times, so after a3, queen to b5 attacking another pawn. These are all forced moves. After queen to e2, defending the pawn, suggesting a swap with this tremendous queen, black continues a queen to b3. The idea is to play g5, then knight to c5 and knight to a4 to capitalize on this weak b2 pawn. And also this has paralyzed the white knight. The knight can't move to d2 without losing this pawn, it can't move anywhere else, which shows the supremacy of computer thinking. None of these moves were stoppable. If white were to foresee the g5 move, for example, which is very useful in preventing this bishop from moving anywhere basically, and play like f4, then knight to b6 will equally do the job. The knight still got access to squares where it's going to target the weak pawn. Back at this position, we went through what happens after queen takes, what happens after knight takes. Then knight goes to c6, and after castling, a lot of normal moves, e6, white's best move h3, the idea of having a shelter for the bishop, because this bishop is always going to be harassed in this type of games. Bishop e7, queen to d3, normal developing moves, and rook to c8, so it's always kind of the same thing. a3 best by white, idea of stopping the annoying knight b4 move, and after castling and b4, all natural moves by white. Well, it's not like white has to play like that. We don't know what white will do, and there will be no point in stopping the line too early. We're gonna look through the ideas, try to understand what are the weaknesses. b4 is a typical move in this case because the white player will have to try and gain space somewhere. He can't really start an attack on the king side. I mean, he can, but that's too weakening at the moment. You can't really take that risk. After b4, a5. This is how we battle this. This is a battle of equal pawns, 2 against 2. White does have a majority on the side, but this pawn is just backwards, and we have a pawn protecting c4, so we don't have to worry about that. After b5, knight b8 is the best move by black, and after a4, it looks like white has gained some space on the queen side. Now the knight can go back to d7, and then b6 and c4. And that's how we're going to be controlling the file. This square is never going to be challenged by any pawn. So white's best plan will be to do the exact same thing. So knight to c1, knight to b6, and then both knights can reach these favorable squares. The difference is that this knight is here to stay forever. This knight going to c5 will not be staying forever, because we do have a pawn on the b file. They can attack it. So back at the starting position, after e3 and we attack the queen, what happens if white doesn't block with the bishop or with the pawn, but rather plays knight g to e2? Now we can take the pawn. The knight is pinned, and so white has to take with the pawn. Taking with the queen will just lose tempos, so after e takes back, knight c6 comes anyway, and after h3 trying to kick away the bishop, this seems to be giving a different setup, right? This doesn't look the same as the previous lines. Bishop goes back to h5, still pinning the knight, and after g4, bishop to g6. It looks like the white player will have to fianchetto, and that's ideal. Actually, it's not too bad, and the knight is finally unpinned. Black plays the normal e6, and after castling, bishop to d6, attacking the dark square bishop. The idea is to start removing pieces that are on the same diagonal or on the same proximity of the white king. After best and most active move, queen to d2, black continues with the usual rook to c8. So as you can see, the patterns are always going to be the same. And after knight to b5, we're going to have to give up the idea of taking one of the future defenders of the king if the bishop were to go to h2, for example, because that will give too much activity to our opponent. We don't want that, so now we play bishop to e7. And we're willing to play a6 so that we don't have to worry about that knight being annoying, and we can replace the bishop back in d6 and just keep the pressure. So for example, if white plays the other knight to c3, then we'd simply attack the knight. Knight goes back, and now queen to b6, attacking the pawn, and after rook to b1, we'd be winning a pawn. So I'm back in this position. If white plays this novelty, right? So white went to b5 with the knight in order to finally play this c4 pawn and ask a question to d5 pawn, so that white will also have a possibility to fight for the open file. Let's remember that the c pawn in the Veresov is not a good pawn, and that's why the Veresov is not really a good opening. Black now simply takes the pawn in c4, and after rook a to c1 attacking the pawn looks like very natural moves. Then a6, knight goes back to a3, and now b5, we can hold the pawn. And let's remember that this pawn can't really be challenged by another pawn because of the bishop.